All right, class, we pick up on our Kohler XT Courage engine, and we're going to do the next series of steps today. So if you remember from last week, we removed the engine cover insert, we removed the engine cover, the blower housing, the recoil or rewind starter, the muffler guard, and the muffler. So today we pick up on page 8.4, and we're going to start by removing the air cleaner assembly. So you can see here, unscrew the knob on the air cleaner assembly and remove the air cleaner. Now once you take the air cleaner cover off, you'll see the air filter itself. This is a pleated filter, a very common style filter used in engines. Remove the paper element and the foam pre-cleaner. This engine does not have a pre-cleaner, so that's a moot step. Underneath the air cleaner, remove 2 hex nuts and the hex flange screw securing the air cleaner base to the cylinder head and crankcase. So these are the 2 hex flange nuts. And this is the 10mm hex screw. And now my air cleaner base is free. You will have to remove the breather tube from the air base before you take it off. And that's step number 4. Detach the breather hose from the crankcase. Step number 5, remove air cleaner base and detach the primer hose from the carburetor. Now this engine in particular does not have a primer. A primer would be used to inject a metered amount of fuel into the throat of the carburetor. That's the throat of the carburetor, so that the engine can start. It gives the carburetor, it gives the engine just a small amount of fuel, so when you're trying to start it, it has something to go on. But this engine does not have a primer. Next will be to remove the air cleaner base gasket from the carburetor, noting its orientation or how it's put on. Now the gasket in our case, it's still on the air cleaner base, which is fine. It's actually better this way. It'll keep it safe. Gaskets are a paper material, most of them, not all of them, but they break easily. So if it's just going to stay on the base, that's fine with me. Now remember, one of my pet peeves is to reinstall fasteners, and normally I would do that, but we still have some parts to take off, so we're going to wait on that. Next step is to remove the carburetor assembly. Ensure the fuel tank is empty by running engine until it stops and it's completely out of fuel. We've already done that. We're going to remove the carburetor. Now in the manual, it has 2 versions of these steps. One, removing a chokeless carburetor, and the other, removing a carburetor with a choke. This carburetor has a choke. Now what a choke is a plate. You can see that plate open and close. What a choke is used for is cold starting of engine. So you go out cold morning and you try to start this engine. Internal combustion engines don't do well with cold air. They want the air to be warm. So what the choke does is it closes down the carburetor, which doesn't allow any cold air to enter the engine for a short period of time. Then as the engine starts to go and the air temperature increases, it'll open up that carburetor. Because an engine is much like a human. It has to have air to operate. It's got to breathe. It's got to bring in air. It's got to exhaust air. But the choke is just closing that off just for a short period of time to minimize the amount of cold air that comes into the engine. So this system does have a choke. So we're going to follow this procedure here. Squeeze the hose clamp and slide it and the fuel hose off of the carburetor. So if I've already removed the hose clamp, it's just a simple spring clamp. You take the two prongs, squeeze them together with some long nose pliers, and you can move that hose clamp off of the barbed fitting which the hose would be on. There's a barbed fitting. Slide carburetor to the end of the intake studs. So these are the intake studs. So as the manual implies, I'm going to slide that carburetor off. Turn the throttle lever clockwise until it stops. Gently push the rod and spring linkage up to disconnect them from the throttle lever. So as I mentioned, this is the choke and the choke linkage. This would be the throttle. What does the throttle do? The throttle controls engine speed by controlling how much air and fuel come into the engine. The more air and fuel we can bring into the engine, the faster it will go. So we're going to remove the throttle linkage by doing just as the manual said. We're going to take that fitting all the way clockwise until we can't go any further. And we're going to remove the linkage and the linkage spring. Number 4, rotate the carburetor until the choke linkage can be disconnected from the carburetor. Here's the choke linkage controlling the choke plate. So we'll rotate that so that our carburetor is free. This is a float bowl style carburetor. Very common carburetor in small engines, as long as the engine doesn't rotate a lot. If it's on an engine that rotates a lot, it's turned side to side, up and down, like you might find on a chainsaw. This isn't the carburetor that would be used. Number 5, slide off the carburetor's heat shield, head spacer, and spacer gasket, noting orientation. So here's the heat shield. This is the spacer gasket. Behind the spacer gasket is this is the spacer and then the spacer gasket. You can see those there. Heat shield, head spacer, spacer gasket. Next, we're going to remove the governor spring. Now the governing system controls engine speed. So I just talked about the throttle. Again, the throttle is going to control how much air and fuel come into the engine, and that's going to determine engine speed. The governor is there to ensure that the throttle doesn't bring in too much fuel and too much air. You bring in too much fuel and air, you cause excessive heat or excessive vibration, and the engine will fail. So the governor controls RPM. Now, this first step is talking about the governor spring. This is the governor spring here. So we will pull that spring off. without bending it. That's always a challenge. And then we'll take it off of the top linkage, and there's your governor spring. Next, remove speed control bracket by removing the 2 hex flange screws securing the speed control bracket. This is the speed control bracket. It houses the top linkage of the governor spring. It houses the top linkage of the throttle and also the choke. So it controls everything having to do with the engine speed, hence the name speed control bracket. So I've already loosened these. These are 10mm hexagonal screws. So once I take those out, the lock comes off. So we have our fuel line, including our fuel filter, which helps clean the fuel before it comes into the engine. All the little fuel line clamps on the fuel line. We have our speed control bracket. I'm going to take these fasteners, I'm going to put those right back in the engine so I don't lose them. I'm going to take off the breather hose just so it's out of the way. Take off the linkages, throttle and choke. All right, so we've taken off the speed control bracket. Next will be to remove the governor lever. We've talked about the governor. The governor again is going to control engine speed. Loosen the governor lever hex nut and slide the lever off of the governor shaft. Okay, so here's the lever. A little black part you can see there is the governor shaft. So we will loosen again. I've pre-loosened all of this. So if you were doing this, they would be tight. Once I loosen that hexagonal nut, I can slide the governor lever right off of the governor shaft. Okay, so here we are removing the fuel tank. Ensure the fuel tank is empty by running the engine until it stops and is completely out of fuel. Detach the fuel tank from the crankcase bracket by removing the 2 hex flange screws. And it shows a diagram here. On the actual engine, those 2 hex screws are right here. So I've pre-loosened those, so I'm just going to take those out. I'll put them back in. By the way, I'll reinstall my fasteners here. These are the 2 for the carburetor and the air cleaner base. And then this one was for the speed control bracket and the base, the air cleaner base. All right, so we've done that. Number 3, remove the 2 studs securing the top of the fuel tank and lift off the fuel tank. Note, disassembly does not require the fuel tank bracket be removed from the bottom of the tank. This is the bracket it's talking about. So it's saying you don't have to take that off. If removal is to be performed, unscrew the 2 hex bracket screws. So we're going to take these studs off, and that'll allow us to take the fuel tank off. faster way. There we go. So once I take these two studs off, fuel tank is off. All right, so we've taken our studs off, fuel tank's off. I'm gonna leave those studs off for now, but I am gonna put them back on. I am gonna take the two screws that came out of the bottom of the fuel tank and reinstall those so they don't get lost. All right, so we've got the fuel tank off. There's a fuel tank coming off of the engine. Next will be to remove the ignition module, or you might hear me refer to it as the ignition armature. This device induces or creates electricity. So one of the first steps, actually the first step, was to disconnect the spark plug boot from the spark plug. Well, the ignition module is the very part that creates the electricity in the system that shoots electrons down that wire to the spark plug. So we're going to take that part off. So first, disconnect the kill lead from the ignition module. So this is the ignition module or ignition armature, and this is the kill lead. And the kill lead is an electric shutoff. So some of you might mow the lawn at home, and if you do,